Hey folks, welcome to Deep Dive Dispatch, the podcast where we don't just scratch the surface. We dig deep into the political landscapes that shape our world today. I'm excited to introduce your guides on this journey through history and headlines, John Matthews and his insightful co-host, Sarah Collins. Together, they'll peel back the layers of complex political issues, offering a slightly conservative viewpoint while staying rooted in facts and historical context. So, buckle up for a thought-provoking ride as we dive into the stories behind the stories. This is Deep Dive Dispatch. Let's get started.
Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to tackle tariffs, specifically through the lens of Trump's Agenda 47.
Yeah, this one should be interesting.
Oh, absolutely. It's like a trip through history, economics, and some hardcore international strategy all at once.
Exactly. And it's not as simple as it might seem at first glance.
Right. I mean, on the surface, it's like, okay, tariffs, they make foreign goods more expensive, but the implications are way deeper.
That's right. We're talking potential impacts on jobs, prices, even global power dynamics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've got a ton of great source material for this one. Some classic economic theory,
Oh, yeah.
some modern policy analysis, even a look back at the history of tariffs in the U.S.
Should give us a pretty well-rounded view.
Definitely. Our mission, if you will, is to really unpack how Trump sees tariffs as this like a central tool in his economic agenda.
Like the tip of the spear, you could
Yeah,
say.
exactly.
Yeah.
And Agenda 47 lays out 3 ways he wants to use them, almost like 3 prongs of an attack.
That's a great way to put it.
First, he wants to pump money directly into the U.S. Treasury using tariffs.
Sort of a back-to-basics approach.
Right. Second, to protect American industries from foreign competition. So it's a defensive move, too.
Like a shield.
Totally. And third, he wants to use tariffs as leverage to get better trade deals for the U.S.
Which has always been a controversial tactic.
Oh, for sure. But let's start with some historical context, because this tariff debate isn't new, is it?
Not at all. In fact, we're going to go all the way back to the 19th century for this one.
Okay, back when the U.S. was still finding its economic footing.
Exactly. We'll be looking at Frank Tausig's book, The Tariff History of the United States.
Okay, so what was the big controversy back then when it came to tariffs?
Well, the main battle was over this idea of protecting infant industries.
Ancient industries.
Yeah, think of it like a new business just starting out, trying to get its legs under it.
Yeah, okay.
Protectionists like William McKinley argued that tariffs were absolutely crucial to give these new American businesses a fighting chance.
Because otherwise they'd get crushed by bigger, more established foreign companies.
That was the fear, yeah. They said without that protection, these infant industries would just get wiped out.
So basically, give them some breathing room to grow and become competitive.
Exactly. But of course, there's always another side to the story.
Right.
Yeah.
There had to be some downsides to this.
Yeah. Opponents argued that, sure, tariffs might help some industries get started, but they also lead to higher prices for consumers.
Makes sense if you're limiting competition.
Right. When you make it harder for foreign goods to enter the market, domestic companies can raise prices.
And the average American ends up paying more for everything.
Exactly. And that tension, that back and forth over the pros and cons of tariffs,
Yeah.
well, it's been a constant throughout American economic history.
So Trump's Agenda 47 isn't really a new idea. It's more like,
A revival of an old debate.
Yeah, like he's tapping into this long-standing argument.
Absolutely. He's brought it back to the forefront of economic policy.
Okay, so let's dive into the first prong of Trump's strategy. Using tariffs to directly fund the Treasury. Now, is that even possible in today's world?
Well, it's certainly an interesting move, and it might surprise you to learn that historically, tariffs were actually a major source of revenue for the U.S. government.
Really?
Yeah, especially back in the 19th century before income tax became the primary source.
So tariffs were like the cash cow.
They were a huge deal. But of course, the world has changed a lot since then, hasn't it?
Right, we have a much more complex tax system now.
Exactly. And now income taxes are the primary source of government revenue.
Makes sense.
And in fact, there's this research from the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research that shows how concentrated the tax burden really is.
Oh, interesting.
They found that less than 1% of C corporations pay over 85% of all federal corporate income taxes.
Wow, that's a lot on a very small group.
It is. So the question becomes, are tariffs really a viable way to bring in significant revenue in today's global economy?
Yeah, it's almost like
Trying to turn back the clock.
exactly. Or is it more like wishful thinking? Like, can you really go back to using tariffs as this major source of income?
It's a big question and one we'll have to explore further.
For sure. But before we do, let's talk about that second prong, protecting U.S. industry from foreign competition. How does that actually work, and is it really effective?
Well, the argument is that by making foreign goods more expensive through tariffs,
Right.
you can level the playing field for American businesses.
Because they're facing competition from countries where wages are lower, production costs are lower.
Exactly, and that makes it tough for them to compete.
Yeah, and it's been a major talking point, right? This idea of American jobs being lost to countries with cheaper labor.
Absolutely. And the goal of tariffs, in this case, would be to make those foreign goods more expensive.
So American-made products become more attractive to consumers.
Right, and theoretically, that helps protect American jobs and businesses.
Okay, so that's the theory.
Yeah.
But does it actually work in practice?
Well, it's tricky. You know, whenever you start messing with trade policy, there are always winners and losers.
Right, there's no easy fix.
Exactly. And one example that really highlights this complexity is the impact of Chinese manufacturing on U.S. industries.
Yeah, that's been a huge issue, right?
Absolutely. China's rise as this manufacturing powerhouse has led to a lot of American companies moving production overseas.
To take advantage of those lower costs.
Right. It's called offshoring. And it's been happening for decades.
And this resulted in a lot of those job losses that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And there's this Boston Consulting Group article that we have that really puts this into perspective.
Oh, what does it say?
Well, it mentions that over 90% of North American companies have moved at least some production abroad in the past 5 years.
Wow, 90%.
That's a staggering figure. It really shows you just how intense the pressure is on American businesses to cut costs and stay competitive.
Yeah, you can see why some people are calling for tariffs to protect those industries.
Right. But on the other hand, if we just slap tariffs on everything to protect American businesses, doesn't that kind of go against the basic principles of economics?
Right. Like, I'm thinking about the concept of comparative advantage.
You're right on the money there. That's a key concept in international trade.
So, for those who don't know, what is comparative advantage exactly?
Basically, it's this idea that countries should focus on producing and exporting the goods and services that they're relatively best at.
Even if another country can produce those same things more cheaply.
Exactly. The idea is that by specializing in what you're good at, you can increase overall efficiency and productivity.
And ultimately, everyone benefits, right? Because
Okay.
goods and services are produced more efficiently and therefore more cheaply.
That's the theory, at least, and it's a theory that's been supported by a lot of economists over the years.
But it seems like the idea of using tariffs to protect American industries kind of goes against that, doesn't it?
It does, because if we're shielding American industries from all competition,
Even if they're not the most efficient producers.
yeah, it could actually end up hurting the economy overall.
So it's like we're propping them up artificially.
Exactly. And that can lead to all sorts of unintended consequences. Like it might stifle innovation.
Right.
Because those companies don't have the same pressure to improve and become more efficient.
And ultimately, it could make American goods and services less competitive on the global market.
That's the risk. And our source, International Economics Theory and Policy, really delves into this dilemma.
Okay, so we've talked about using tariffs to fund the Treasury and using them to protect U.S. industry. Now, what about that third prong? Using tariffs as bargaining chips in trade negotiations. How does that work?
Well, the basic idea is to use tariffs as leverage.
Okay.
To pressure other countries into making concessions that are favorable to the U.S.
So it's kind of like saying, hey, if you don't give us what we want, we're going to make it more expensive for you to sell your goods in our market.
Exactly. And it can be a pretty aggressive tactic.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Are there any examples of when this has actually worked?
Well, one case that comes to mind is the use of tariffs on Japanese automobiles back in the 1980s.
Oh, right. I remember hearing about that.
Yeah, the U.S. auto industry was struggling at the time, and the Reagan administration imposed tariffs on Japanese cars to protect American manufacturers.
So did it work? Did Japan cave to the pressure?
Well, they eventually agreed to voluntary export restraints,
Right.
which limited how many cars they could sell in the U.S. But whether that was a true win for the U.S. is debatable.
I can see how it would be complicated.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly protected American automakers in the short term,
Right.
but it also led to higher prices for American consumers.
Because there was less competition.
Exactly. And some argue that it actually hurt the long-term competitiveness of the U.S. auto industry.
Because they didn't have to innovate as much?
Right. They didn't have the same pressure to improve their products and become more efficient.
So it's like a double-edged sword?
Exactly. And that's something that international economics theory and policy really emphasizes. Using tariffs as a bargaining chip can be a really risky strategy.
Right.
It can backfire and lead to trade wars,
Right.
which can damage international relations.
Yeah, and ultimately hurt everyone involved.
Exactly. And the book uses specific examples, like an analysis of the effects of tariffs on sugar,
Oh, interesting.
to illustrate just how unpredictable these outcomes can be.
So it's not as simple as just throwing up a tariff wall and saying, give us what we want.
No, it's a lot more complicated than that. You have to consider all the potential repercussions.
Right, and that brings us to a key question for our listeners. Are tariffs a risky but potentially effective way to get a better deal in trade negotiations?
Or are there more diplomatic and collaborative approaches that might be less disruptive in the long run?
That's a great question to think about.
Yeah.
And it really gets to the heart of this debate.
It does. We've covered a lot of ground here, from the historical roots of tariffs to Trump's three-pronged strategy for using them.
And we've seen that there are a lot of different perspectives on this issue.
Absolutely. But there's still one piece of the puzzle that we haven't addressed yet: the rise of the anti-globalization movement.
Yeah, how does that factor into all of this?
Well, that's a really important question, and we'll delve into it in more detail in our next segment.
Okay, so stay tuned, folks. We're going to explore how the backlash against globalization is shaping the debate over tariff.
And how Agenda 47 fits into this larger
It's
context.
going to be a fascinating discussion, so don't miss it.
Hey everyone, just taking a moment to send a huge shout out to all of you tuning in to Deep Dive Dispatch. Your support really keeps us going. And if you're enjoying the deep dives and want to help us continue bringing you these thought-provoking discussions, head over to deepdivedispatch.com. It's an awesome way to support the show and keep the conversation alive. Big thanks for being part of our community. Now, let's jump back into the next part of our episode and keep unraveling these intriguing topics. Enjoy.
It's really interesting how much Trump's approach to tariffs, taps into this whole anti-globalization feeling that's been growing for years.
Yeah, it's like he's speaking directly to people who feel like globalization has left them behind.
Exactly. Agenda 47, with its focus on protectionism and tariffs, it's almost a direct response to that anxiety.
Like a way to say, we're putting America first, we're bringing jobs back, we're protecting our industries.
Exactly. It's about reasserting American economic power, pushing back against what some people see as the negative effects of globalization.
But it's not that straightforward, is it? Globalization has had both positive and negative impacts.
Absolutely. If you look at the big picture, globalization has lifted millions of people out of poverty around the world.
Right, and it's created these incredible interconnected economies.
Exactly. But at the same time, it's also created winners and losers.
Yeah, some people have definitely been hurt by globalization, lost their jobs, seen their wages stagnate.
Exactly. And those are the people who are most receptive to this message of protectionism.
So it's a tough balancing act, right?
It is. How do you address the very real concerns of those who've been negatively impacted by globalization?
Right.
Without resorting to policies that could harm the economy as a whole.
Exactly. So we can't ignore those concerns,
Right.
but we also have to be realistic about the potential downsides of using tariffs as the primary tool.
Yeah, if tariffs lead to higher prices for consumers, retaliation from other countries, or a slowdown in innovation, it could backfire.
And end up hurting the very people it's supposed to help.
Exactly. So it's a really delicate situation.
It really is. And it makes you wonder, are tariffs really the answer? Or is there a better way to address these concerns without resorting to protectionist measures?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's something that policymakers are grappling with all over the world.
But let's get back to Agenda 47 for a minute.
Okay.
We've talked about the history of tariffs, the anti-globalization movement, Trump's three-pronged strategy, but there's another important piece of the puzzle: tax policy.
You're right. That played a huge role in Trump's overall economic agenda.
Yeah, remember that massive tax cut bill he signed early in his presidency?
The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. Oh, yeah, that was a major overhaul of the tax code.
And it's relevant to our discussion of tariffs.
Absolutely. The Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research has some great analysis of this.
Okay, what do they say?
Well, they point out how the law significantly reduced the corporate tax rate and offered all sorts of new tax breaks for businesses.
Okay, but how does that tie back to tariffs? I'm not seeing the connection.
One of the main arguments for tariffs is that they can help offset the loss of government revenue from those tax cuts.
Oh, I see. So you cut taxes for corporations, and then you use tariffs to make up the difference.
That's the idea. It's a way to try and balance the books.
But it sounds a little like robbing Peter to pay Paul.
It does, doesn't it?
And it brings us back to that first prong of Agenda 47, using tariffs to directly fund the Treasury.
Exactly. But, as we talked about before, there are some serious questions about how effective that strategy can really be.
Right, especially in today's globalized economy.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about all those potential unintended consequences.
Like higher prices for consumers and retaliation from other countries.
Exactly. It's a complex issue with a lot of moving parts.
So what's the bottom line for our listeners?
When it comes to tariffs, there are no easy answers. It's important to weigh the potential benefits against the potential costs.
And think critically about whether they're really the best way to achieve Trump's stated goals.
Exactly. Are tariffs a magic solution to bring back jobs and protect American industries?
Or are they a blunt instrument that could end up doing more harm than good?
Those are the questions we all need to be asking.
Absolutely. Well said.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've explored the history of tariffs, the anti-globalization sentiment, Trump's three-pronged strategy.
And how tax policy fits into the picture.
But we're not done yet. In part 3, we're going to look at how Trump's tariff strategy actually played out in the real world.
We'll examine some specific cases.
Analyze the outcomes.
And try to draw some valuable lessons from those experiences.
So stay tuned, folks. This deep dive is far from over.
Hey everyone, just taking a moment to send a huge shout out to all of you tuning in to Deep Dive Dispatch. Your support really keeps us going. And if you're enjoying the deep dives and want to help us continue bringing you these thought-provoking discussions, head over to deepdivedispatch.com. It's an awesome way to support the show and keep the conversation alive. Big thanks for being part of our community. Now, let's jump back into the next part of our episode and keep unraveling these intriguing topics. Enjoy.
Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into tariffs and Trump's Agenda 47.
We've covered a lot of ground. The history, the theory, the arguments.
Yeah, but now it's time to see how it all played out in the real world, right?
Exactly. Let's move from the hypothetical to the actual. What actually happened when those tariffs were put into place?
So where do we begin? What are some of the key examples of Trump's tariff strategy in action?
Well, you can't talk about Trump and tariffs without mentioning the trade war with China.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one. It dominated the news for months.
It did, and it really brought those risks and complexities of using tariffs as a negotiating tactic into the spotlight.
Because it wasn't just about economics, right? It felt like there was this geopolitical element to it as well.
Absolutely. There were these broader tensions between the U.S. and China, and the trade war became a focal point for those tensions.
So remind us, what were the main points of contention in that trade war?
Well, the U.S. accused China of engaging in a number of unfair trade practices.
Okay, like what?
Things like intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, currency manipulation.
Basically, the U.S. felt like China wasn't playing by the rules.
Right, and Trump argued that tariffs were necessary to protect American businesses and jobs from these practices.
So it was about leveling the playing field.
Exactly. Trump's view was that China had been taking advantage of the U.S. for years and that it was time to push back.
But China didn't just sit there and take it, did they?
No, they retaliated with tariffs of their own, targeting key American exports like soybeans and agricultural products.
So it became this tit-for-tat escalation.
It did, and ultimately it hurt businesses and consumers on both sides.
Right, because global supply chains were disrupted, prices increased for a lot of goods.
Exactly, and there was all this uncertainty in the markets, which made it difficult for businesses to plan for the future.
So was there a clear winner in this trade war? Or was it just a big, messy stalemate?
It's tough to say. The U.S. did eventually reach a trade deal with China.
But it's hard to know how much of that was due to the tariffs and how much was just the natural course of negotiations.
Exactly. Some argue that the tariffs did put pressure on China and force them to make concessions.
But others say they were counterproductive and caused unnecessary economic harm.
Right. So the jury's still out on whether the tariffs were ultimately effective.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about the trade war with China, but there are other examples of Trump's tariff strategy that are worth looking at. Well, another significant move was his decision to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum imports.
Oh, right. And that wasn't just targeted at China.
No, those tariffs applied to several countries, including close U.S. allies like Canada, Mexico, and the European Union.
And if I remember correctly, he justified those tariffs by citing national security concerns.
That's right. He argued that the U.S. needed to maintain a strong domestic steel and aluminum industry for its military readiness and independence.
To be self-sufficient in case of a conflict, essentially.
Exactly. And he invoked this rarely used provision of trade law, Section 232, to impose these tariffs.
But that move also sparked a lot of controversy, didn't it?
It did, both domestically and internationally.
Because people questioned whether the national security justification was legitimate.
Right. Some argued that it was a flimsy excuse to protect a few specific industries while harming the broader economy.
And it also created tensions with some of America's closest allies.
It did. The EU and Canada retaliated with tariffs of their own, targeting iconic American products.
Yeah, like bourbon and Harley-Davidson motorcycles.
Exactly. So it really strained those relationships and raised questions about the U.S.'s commitment to free trade.
So it seems like Trump's use of tariffs, both with China and with the steel and aluminum tariffs, was a mixed bag.
Yeah, there were some potential benefits, but also a lot of unintended consequences and collateral damage.
It definitely shook things up and challenged some long-held assumptions about global trade.
It did. But whether it was ultimately successful in achieving its goals is still up for debate.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into tariffs and Trump's Agenda 47, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What can we learn from all of this?
Well, I think one of the biggest lessons is that tariffs are a blunt instrument.
Right, they're not a precision tool.
Exactly. And they can have a lot of unintended consequences.
And sometimes those consequences can outweigh any potential benefits.
That's right. So while tariffs might have a role to play in certain situations,
Yeah.
they're not a magic solution to complex trade challenges.
And it's crucial to weigh those costs and benefits very carefully.
Absolutely. And to consider all the potential ramifications before using them.
So it's about being strategic and thoughtful.
Exactly. Tariffs should be used judiciously, not as a knee-jerk reaction or a political weapon.
Because ultimately, the goal should be to create a fair and stable global trading system that benefits everyone.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into tariffs and Trump's Agenda 47.
It's been a pleasure exploring this complex issue with you.
And to all our listeners out there, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep those minds engaged.
Until next time, stay curious.
Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to Deep Dive Dispatch. We hope you found today's episode enlightening and packed full of insight. Remember, your support keeps us diving deep into the stories that matter. So if you enjoyed the show, make sure to download and share it with others who crave a deeper understanding of politics and history. And don't forget, we want to hear from you. If there's a topic out there that you think deserves a deep dive, reach out and let us know. Your input helps us bring you the most compelling content week after week. Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll catch you next time on Deep Dive Dispatch. Keep exploring, folks.